When I first purchased Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time, I wondered if this game could even come close in comparison to Naughty Dog's original Crash titles. While I was never a mega fan of the marsupials' first outings, I did still enjoy playing them from time to time, especially Warped. The environments were bright, colorful, and full of detail in a way that not many other games were at the time, and the characters were a perfect blend of cool and cute. There was just always a sense of spectacle, no matter what was happening on the screen, and it paired up wonderfully with the chaotic and challenging platforming that demanded precision and timing from the player. The games gifted you tight controls and set you free to master them. A rudimentary understanding of how the game handled was enough to get you through the experience with just a few cuts and scrapes. But if you wanted to go for 100% completion, it took dedication, patience, and sheer willpower to prevail. To me, those PlayStation 1 discs housed some sort of magic in them that made me respect the platforming genre in a way that I really hadn't before. And so we flash forward to today, and I was convinced that a different developer wouldn't be able to recapture that charmed feeling. And that doubt is what aroused the original question in the inner workings of my mind. Could Crash Bandicoot 4 even come close in comparison to Naughty Dog's original Crash titles? Well, now that I've finished Crash 4, I find myself asking a different question. Is Crash 4 the best Crash Bandicoot game of all time? That alone should be a ringing endorsement for this game, but it's also an honest question that I intend to answer for myself by poking and prodding at the components that make up this title. Given the subjectivity of it, I can only answer that question for myself, but I hope you'll join me in my efforts to unravel Crash 4. So with that, welcome to Crash's Furiatingly fun return. My review of Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. So, after the IP left Naughty Dog, Crash was thrown into a dark age where the platformers couldn't live up to the quality of the originals, and the spin-offs and new takes never recaptured the fan base. For years, the series went dormant until the release of the N. Sane Trilogy, which sold incredibly well, hinting that there was still a market to be tapped for Crash games of old. With help from a few other studios, Toys for Bob began working on Crash 4 It's About Time, and after it was published by Activision, the game released on October 2nd, 2020. The game opted to rewind time and present a gameplay loop identical to Naughty Dog's originals. But perhaps identical isn't the right word to use. Sure, you still run, jump, spin, and slide through a series of linear platforming levels, but a whole cluster of mechanics and ideas have been assembled to test the player in original and exciting ways. Given the title's focus on time travel, it only makes sense to look at the Quantum Masks as the first big new change to gameplay. Throughout the story, Crash, Coco, and others encounter 4 ancient masks that rule over time and space. Oh, and by the way, these 4 masks, right here, they would definitely kick the crap out of the elemental mask from Wrath of Cortex. So while the masks do appear frequently throughout the narrative, their inclusion is mostly a gameplay consideration, as each of them changes things up and provides new platforming trials for the players to prove themselves with. For simplicity's sake, I'm just going to call them Blue Mask, Red Mask, Yellow Mask, and Green Mask, but they do have names in the game world, but to be honest, I was never bothered enough to memorize them. Whenever Crash stumbles upon one of these masks, they equip to him and give him a cool new look while also offering an alternate gameplay style. The blue mask is capable of phasing things in and out of the world at the touch of a button. Most of the challenges involve using this mask to phase platforms in and out of existence while in midair, which takes timing and accuracy to complete successfully. The red mask allows the player to go anti-gravity for a bit by extending their jump heights and locking them into a constant spin so long as the mask is active. This mask is about giving the player a lot of power, but challenging them to use it at appropriate times. Sure, you get extra height on your bounce and can plow through enemies, but spinning into a TNT or nitro crate still means death. And as the game goes on, challenges involving this mask take away more and more stable platforms, requiring the player to both use the mask and restrain its usage from moment to moment depending on the setup. Next up, the yellow mask is capable of slowing down time for all things in the environment except for Crash. You get a small window of time to slow down fast-moving objects so that you can platform across them safely. While it does allow you to walk on nitro crates, this mask does the least to change up gameplay. It usually just becomes your standard platforming once you slow down time. Rarely does the game ever make the slowed time period short enough to feel like a threat. And finally, the green mask flips gravity so that Crash can walk on ceilings. This proves to be a bit disorienting in some ways, but the perspective shift is still a neat inclusion. Its best usage comes when the player has to quickly alternate between regular and inverted gravity. So if I had to rate the mask from best to worst, I'd say blue is best, followed by green, red, and then yellow. While the blue mask makes for my personal favorite inclusion, all of them are well implemented because they offer up new components for the player to consider without sacrificing the fast-paced, ever-moving gameplay that the series features and encourages. The only concession is that the success of their implementation varies on a case-by-case basis. However, I wouldn't call any of these masks a bad inclusion. But that's something that I can't really say for the new playable characters. In Crash 4, there are levels dedicated to playing as Tawna, Dingodile, and Cortex. Given that this game features more levels than any other Crash game, it makes sense on paper to offer up some alternate playstyles to cut down on the game feeling like a slog. But in practice, the results here are mixed. Tawna is by far the best new character because she's capable of doing just about everything that Crash and Coco can do, but she also has a grapple hook that adds some variety. It forces the player to be more aware of their surroundings as to not fall to their death by missing a grapple point. And then there's Dingodile. He plays a completely different pace than the previous characters, and spoilers, it's slower. He's had his flamethrower nerfed into a vacuum gun that allows the player to suck up and throw crates, while also providing a brief hover move to cross gaps. The best part about playing as Dingodile, though, is that all of his levels get a ton of boxes in them, and that provides that satisfaction of breaking a ton of crates at once that many series veterans have felt over the decades. Dingodile's inclusion ends up being just alright. Really, it's not worthwhile or offensive. I don't have any major issues with it, but I also don't feel like it slots in perfectly to this style of gameplay. Cortex, though, Cortex, just no. His levels stumble into that classic pitfall where the player's ability to move around the environment has been restricted to create new gameplay mechanics. If I've said it once, I've said it before. I don't like when games limit a player's ability to move. When they do this in story sections, it oftentimes comes off as pretentious. Like the developers are saying, look what we made here, it's amazing and you're gonna take it all in, whether you like it or not. And in gameplay sections, it's a synthetic and cheap way of ramping up difficulty by robbing the player of their full skill sets. And Cortex levels fall into this trap. Cortex can't double jump, and that alone robs him of a key feature that all 4 other characters have. He instead has a dash that doesn't provide the same mobility mid-air as a double jump. This factor alone makes it feel like Cortex is played with a ball and chain attached at the leg, and it kills the pace for me. Now, he does have a ranged attack, but oftentimes it's hard to line up given that it doesn't have a lock-on, or at least a reticle like the Wampa Bazooka did in previous games. The Cortex levels are just a slog. There's no other way to put it. I hated pretty much all of them, but luckily there aren't many of them. These levels where you play as alternate characters are called timelines, because often they will transition halfway through to playing as Crash in a section from a previous level. The sections where you play as Tawna, Dingodile, or Cortex are unique sections built specifically for that level, but they end with an event that triggers something happening in a previous level. It's supposed to give the feeling that all the characters are navigating the world at the same time, at their own pace, which is neat. And after the event takes place, things switch back to Crash where you traverse familiar territory. However, the nice consideration is that these sections have been remixed in terms of enemies and crate placement, which makes it feel fresh. It's a really great idea, and I love these timelines, even if I don't like playing as Cortex. So those are 3 big new additions, but Crash 4 doesn't stop there. It just keeps on giving. In previous games, death routes could only be accessed if the player reached that point in the level without dying. Here, that idea is replaced with flashback tapes that can only be collected if you reach them without dying. These unlock throwback levels that are presented as trial runs that Crash had to make when Cortex was testing him back in the lab. These provide a whole other roster of levels for players to try out, which adds a ton of value to the game. And that's important to bring up as well. Going into this, I couldn't believe that the game was going to be $60, but it earns that price tag by offering the player a ton of levels, plus this whole lineup of flashback levels. Oh, and you can also play every platforming level inverted, which adds even more things to do for completionists. You really don't have to worry about not getting your money's worth. So that accounts for the new additions, but let's take a step back and see how the game holds up in terms of pure platforming. Now, I'm no Crash expert, but to me, what stood out about the originals was how tight things were on the controls. It didn't matter if you were a beginner or an expert, the controls immediately felt responsive and didn't create errors outside of the player's control, at least most of the time. You rarely felt cheated out of a life because of button inputs not aligning with how things played out on the screen. Unfortunately, the controls of Crash 4, while pretty good, don't live up to this same standard, and I experienced so many deaths that didn't necessarily feel like my fault. The controls felt just a notch too floaty for my taste instead of being as sharp as they were in the originals. This affected me both in 2D side-scrolling sections as well as in 3D sections where you had to platform over large gaps. There were too many times where I jumped and came up short of a safe ledge and fell to my death when I felt that I had input the commands perfectly. And this remained an issue throughout the game, even despite the fact that they included a highlighted circle below your character to see where they would land. There was just too many times where I perished in ways that didn't feel like my fault. And this isn't me trying to blame my own failures on the game design. It truly felt like it robbed me of a few lives throughout the experience. And when every level requires such precision to nab every box or avoid dying more than 3 times to earn a gem, this issue compounds and ends up being very frustrating and taxing on your life counter. Okay, so my next big complaint is definitely a subjective one. Let me just acknowledge that right now. But I have an issue with the difficulty curve of this game. I'll give the game props, because it is a pretty gradual increase to difficulty. But there's so many levels that by the time you reach the last zone, the challenges become insane. Seriously, to the people who developed the Cortex Castle level, you are a threat to society. When I find myself losing 15, 20, 30, and even 40 lives within a single level, then I think that's an issue. Now, the developers do smartly include much more Wampa Fruit than in previous games, meaning you can break even on lives lost versus lives gained. Still, there comes a point where the game's demands of you feel downright unfair, and when you pair that up with the control issues, it can lead to a lot of player fatigue. It doesn't give you a feeling of accomplishment to finish a level after dying 20 times, you're just glad it's over. You can load me up on Wampa Fruit so that I break even on lives lost, but that doesn't resolve the frustration of dying so many times on one level. The fun is robbed from the player. And this issue with difficulty really affects the final third of the game, where I died at least 15 times in just about every level. And I cannot imagine going for 100% completion in this game. And if you're able to do that, you must be a masochist. I'm sorry, it's true. I mean, this is brutal. Completing everything in the game means beating every level and boss, including the flashback tapes. It also involves collecting every gem, and they're handled completely differently this time around. You have to complete a series of challenges that each unlock one gem. There's 3 gems for collecting 40, 60, and 80% of all Wampa Fruit in the level. There's a gem for collecting all the boxes in a level. There's a gem for dying less than 3 times in a finished run. And on top of that, there's also a hidden gem in each level. Oh, and you have to earn all the gems again in inverted mode doing the same exact things. So yeah, there's a lot of gems. And I guess I should mention the gems are also used to unlock skins, which I guess is an okay incentive. It doesn't do much for me, but I guess it's better than nothing. But as you can see, there is a ton of things to collect. If you love being a completionist, then you're going to love this experience. But for me, I can't imagine going after all this stuff because of how hard the game is. So as I begin to wrap up this section on gameplay, I feel like I've been somewhat harsh towards the title. But let me be clear, despite the issues, Crash 4 offers the player a ton of well-designed levels full of different challenges to complete. The game introduces so many fresh ideas to the series and commits to them for better or worse on a case-by-case basis. Ultimately, it's been 22 years since Crash Warp released, and I'm more than willing to look past all the issues just to have a new, traditional Crash game. I thoroughly enjoyed my playthrough of this game, but with that being said, there is room for tweaked improvements in a 5th entry. There's no doubt about it, Crash 4 is easily the best looking Crash Bandicoot game that has ever released, but that's to be expected given the more powerful hardware. Graphically, the game is gorgeous, with bright and colorful environments that harken back to Crash games of old. The art style feels immediately familiar, like a natural evolution of the graphics we used to know. There's a lot of returning biomes like snowy levels, jungle paths, and futuristic stages, but there's also some new entries like swamps, pirate ships, and even an alien world. Every level is jam-packed with a tremendous amount of detail, both in the foreground and background, and I couldn't help but be impressed. Even though you're on a linear path, the layout of each level makes it appear like these are full worlds that can go far in every direction. Speaking of level design though, there are some issues, specifically in the last hub world where it's sometimes unclear what is part of the level and what isn't. I died a handful of times because the background and foreground seemed to blend, and I found myself touching gears and dying because I thought they weren't interactable. And on top of that, you'll occasionally lose sight of Crash on the screen because so much is going on around you. Still, it's hard to not be impressed with the visuals on display. One element that I think these developers really nailed was finding a way to maintain the feeling of barely escaping a chaotic situation. In the original games, there were so many sequences where Crash just barely escaped. The character was presented and animated in a way that made it clear that he wasn't some platforming tactician. Crash doesn't really have a higher intelligence. He's guided by whatever emotion or desire he's currently experiencing. The game presented these amazing feats of athleticism simply as Crash just getting lucky. It's that cliche idea of a happy-go-lucky fool thwarting an evil genius simply out of dumb luck. That's the feeling that the original games gave by having Crash animated in the way that he was. and it's been continued here and only made better by the ability to detail the character much more than was possible on a PlayStation 1. Let me say it this way, the button inputs must be done precisely to avoid death, and that gets pretty difficult in later stages, even at the midway point of the game. And Crash's tense animations during panic situations, and the relief he displays after escaping by just the skin of his teeth, aligns with how the player feels after pulling off an intense series of button prompts. Both you and the character think, holy shit, I can't believe we just survived that. It's an awesome feeling that Crash 4 captures better than ever before. Moving on, music ended up being surprisingly weak to me. That's not to say it's bad, but it just didn't jive with me. Throughout the experience, the music sounded like a distant cousin to the OST from the original games. They tried to make it feel right up there with the classics, but it just couldn't quite make it up the mountain. The sound work does a great job of cueing you in on incoming threats though, and the voice acting is pretty good across the board. Richard Stephen Horitz voiced the first Quantum Mask, I think his name was Lonnie Lowley, and that definitely ended up being the most memorable performance of the game. I mean, the dude's just voiced so many characters that I grew up with that I can't help but to love his performance. So overall, the presentation of Crash 4 is very well done, save for just a few missteps along the way. I won't be spending too long discussing the story of Crash 4 because even though there are a lot more cutscenes in this iteration, the story only exists to set up the gameplay, and I think that's fine. The same cast of lovable characters have been brought back, including returning favorites like Aku Aku, Tawna, Coco, Cortex, Dingodile, Engine, Entropy, Nitrous Oxide, and Embryo. I did find myself missing characters like Tiny Tiger and Papu Papu, but it's alright, you know, they might show up in a sequel. I mean, I'd be down for some Ripperoo, that's for sure. And the characters here are all immediately recognizable and are reminiscent of their past designs. But they did do my boy Dingodile a little dirty. He's always been my favorite Crash character. I love playing as him in Crash Team Racing, and he's just been made such a chunky boy here. I don't get it. I don't love it. I don't like it. Not a fan of it, but whatever. But anyway, it's your standard Crash story. Cortex and his collaboration of evil scientists have cooked up a new way of taking over the universe, and it's up to Crash, Coco, and Aku Aku to stop them. There are some different twists and turns along the way, with former rivals and friends joining up with you, but it's nothing special. There are a couple of lines of dialogue, though, that do refer back to previous games, and this line is sure to get any Crash fan laughing. I know I did.
More time to plan your doom. You'll find me up the mountain. Don't freeze on the way.
Well, you know, I'm sensing a real fraught history here. How many times have you beaten this clown anyway?
3.
Really? Only 3? Funny. Seemed like more.
Collecting everything in the game will yield an alternate ending, and no, I didn't see it. I just happened to confirm it for myself after scrolling through the trophy list. You're seriously asking me for 106% completion to see the final ending? No thank you, I'm not that dedicated. But yeah, the story on offer here gives you what you expect. A save-the-world plot filled with the characters you've come to admire. That brings me back to my original question. Is Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time the best Crash Bandicoot game? Well, no, Crash Team Racing is, duh. But is it the best platformer? Well, still no. It's bigger, but not necessarily better than all the originals. I have to continue giving that recognition of the best Crash platformer to Crash 2 Cortex Strikes Back, but I do believe it's leapfrogged both the original Crash and Warped for me personally. There's just so much value on offer here, and even though the controls aren't quite as crisp, I can't deny how much enjoyment I got from this title, especially its new ideas around the masks. They just add a whole new layer to Crash Bandicoot platforming that goes a long way in enhancing the core experience. I also enjoy 2 out of the 3 new playable characters, but what I appreciate most about them is that they aren't given way too many levels. No, you still play primarily as Crash or Coco if you so choose, and are exposed to all the classic platform ideas that made the original so great. You've got your standard Crash platforming, your chase sequences, your bonus levels, your clever crate placements, your polar bear riding sections, and so many other great ideas that the series has delivered over the years. In many ways, this feels like a love letter to Crash games of yesterday while still pushing the series into the future. The game does have some notable issues, particularly with difficulty and control scheme, but it's clear that a lot of love went into this title, and I recommend checking it out even if you aren't a fan of platformers. I think it's that good. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopeNapNarp. And as always, have a nice day. And take care.